In the 1920s, hundreds of young women landed what seemed like a dream job, painting glowing numbers onto watch dials. To keep their brushes fine, their employers taught them a simple routine. Point the tip with your lips. Dip it in the glowing paint. Paint the next number. Lips. Dip. Paint. They repeated that motion thousands of times a day. What none of them knew was that every stroke carried radioactive material straight into their bodies. The company knew the paint was dangerous. The women never did. What they'd do next would take down one of the most powerful corporations in America, but only after it cost them their bones, their teeth, and in some cases their lives. By the late 1910s, radium was everywhere in American culture, and nobody feared it. It was marketed as a miracle substance, toothpaste, tonic water, even a treatment for fatigue. Nobody yet understood what sustained exposure actually did to a human body. So when factories like the U.S. Radium Corporation in New Jersey needed workers to hand paint luminous dials for watches, clocks, and military instruments, young women lined up for the job. It paid well. It was steady. It felt almost glamorous. By the end of each shift, the dial painters left dusted in fine radium powder. Their hands, their hair, their clothes, glowing faintly in the dark. Some painted their fingernails with the leftover paint before going dancing. Others decorated their dresses, even their teeth, laughing as they shimmered in the dark. They called themselves, without irony, the Ghost Girls. To them the glow was harmless. It was beautiful. The chemists and managers at the same companies handled radium very differently. Lead aprons, ivory-tipped tongs, protective screens. They knew something the women painting dials did not. A few years into the work, the women started getting sick, but not in any way doctors connected to their jobs. A toothache that wouldn't go away, a stiff jaw, aching joints, and constant fatigue. Doctors treated each case as an isolated illness. No one suspected the factory. Then it got worse. Teeth that had been perfectly healthy began loosening, then falling out. The empty sockets wouldn't heal. Infections spread through the gums and into the bone underneath. When doctors operated, they found something almost unimaginable. The bone wasn't healing. It was dying. Doctors began calling it radium jaw. By then, the damage had spread far beyond the mouth. Radium behaves chemically like calcium. Once swallowed, the body stores it inside the bones, where it keeps releasing radiation for years. Every tiny dose the women had swallowed became a permanent source of damage from within. Their own skeletons were poisoning them. When the women and their families started asking questions, the companies didn't just stay quiet. They pushed back. Company doctors examined the sick workers and reported them as being in good health. Some of those reports were later shown to have been altered or simply falsified. Other women were told, quietly, that their symptoms had nothing to do with work. The suggestion of venereal disease was floated more than once, specifically because it would make the women too ashamed to pursue the matter publicly. At the time, that kind of rumor carried enormous social stigma. For some families, the shame felt almost as devastating as the illness. For years, it worked. The factories kept operating. The dial painters kept getting sick. One woman refused to accept the explanation she'd been given. Her name was Grace Fryer. She'd spent years painting luminous dials. Now her jaw was permanently damaged, and even lifting her arms had become difficult. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. She believed someone had to be held accountable. Finding a lawyer took nearly 2 years. Some attorneys were afraid U.S. Radium would simply overwhelm them in court. Others believed the legal window to sue had already, technically, expired. Grace joined 4 other former dial painters, women who by then could barely raise an arm to take an oath in court. Together, they prepared to challenge one of the most powerful corporations in America. The newspapers gave them a nickname, a brutal one: the Society of the Living Dead. It was harsh, but it brought exactly the kind of attention the case needed. By 1928, the case was impossible to ignore. Newspapers followed every development. Public sympathy was mounting. But time wasn't on the women's side. Some were too weak to walk without help, and every delay in court meant another chance one of them wouldn't live to see the verdict. They weren't just fighting a corporation. They were racing their own bodies. As medical experts linked the illnesses directly to radium exposure, the public started asking the questions U.S. Radium couldn't answer. Why had the women been told to put radioactive paint in their mouths? Why had management taken precautions the workers never received? Facing a devastating trial, U.S. Radium chose not to let the case reach a verdict. The company settled, a payment to each woman, a modest lifelong pension, and coverage of their medical costs. By modern standards, it wasn't much. It couldn't undo the damage or bring back the coworkers who'd already died. But it was one of the first times in American legal history a major corporation was forced to formally accept responsibility for poisoning its own workers. The women hadn't just won compensation, they'd won a precedent. The settlement ended the lawsuit. It didn't end the story. The case became a foundational moment in occupational disease law, establishing that workers could seek damages for illnesses caused by their jobs, even when the symptoms only appeared years later. Just as importantly, the medical data gathered from studying their exposure directly shaped early radiation safety standards, standards that would go on to guide how nuclear materials were handled for decades, in industries these women never lived to see. Most of the original Radium Girls didn't survive to witness the full impact of what they'd done. But every radiation warning sign, every protective suit, every workplace exposure limit in use today carries a small, mostly invisible trace of the women who refused to let their pain be dismissed. The Radium Girls weren't scientists or lawyers or activists when this started. They were just young women who wanted their pain taken seriously. The papers called them the Society of the Living Dead. History proved that name wrong, not because they survived, but because their voices did. Sometimes the biggest changes don't come from a grand plan. They come from a group of people simply refusing to be told they're imagining it. Next video will be about a man who may have prevented World War III,